Exit Liquidity, where you find out how not to be fucking exit liquidity.
So this is episode 8 of the NFTfi summer season we're doing at Exit Liquidity. So we got Oogway and Dylan on the Spice account. I appreciate you guys popping in here, giving us the time. We usually like to start this just kind of giving a brief history about where you've been in the space, but more importantly to kind of signify your stripes, I guess, is to kind of give us your biggest moments where you were someone else's exit liquidity.
All right. Yeah, so I guess I got involved in the space. I used to work in TradFi, kind of mergers and acquisitions, kind of played around, did a few deals in gaming entertainment, fintech, healthcare, really everything under the sun. Kind of a few years into TradFi banking, I got around to playing around in DeFi. Mostly just trading, shaping governance tokens, probably the place where I became a lot of people's exit liquidity, but also got a little exit liquidity myself, was in the rebase token arena. So that was, I think Olympus now would probably be really the first time. I rode that thing out all the way to the end, basically. And yeah, obviously got dumped on pretty hard with other people's exit liquidity, but I think it was a pretty good learning lesson, that's to say.
Yeah, I come from a pretty, or I guess first I can introduce myself. I go by many names nowadays, and maybe even by more names into the future. But currently, I'm known as either Dylan or formerly Shirtless Founder, currently Duncan, and who knows in the future. But yeah, my background is a bit non-traditional. So I was actually a chemical engineer before going into DeFi and crypto. So something kind of out of left field. But the more I've been in the space, the more I've realized that there have been many chemical engineers that have kind of entered into the crypto sphere, maybe for several reasons, but we can go into that if you want to talk about it later. But anyways, like my start in crypto is actually really kind of guided by the two co-founders that I'm working with right now, Oogway, and then our other co-founder, Niet. So they were more, entrenched or more, they had more experience in crypto than I did when we all started Spice together. So they were really my guides going into crypto. But what really interested me about crypto was just like the philosophy around it, the ethos, the personal political alignment I had with the space. So that's really how I entered into the space and really got involved from that angle. I think in terms of exit liquidity, the biggest L I probably took was one that actually like Uruguay and I took together, I think around last year. We were kind of getting involved, or we were looking from the outside in at the Milady community about a year ago. And we were priced out of actually buying Miladies. So we were looking at derivatives, and the one derivative that didn't pop off we bought, which were the soy lads. I had like a 65% soy lad. We got it. I don't think the floor price rose at all, and it just dumped. So I don't think I was necessarily exit liquidity in that situation, but it was an L that I did take.
Yeah, those are some good ones. I do remember the fork moment very vividly. Definitely took some L's there. Were you guys involved in like any projects before Spice? Did you contribute anywhere else? Were you a big fan or a big user of any other projects?
Yeah, well, I had actually been I was one of the first policy members over at Olympus when it first launched. Did that for a few months before leaving, and that's kind of how I also got around to accumulating a non-insignificant own bag. And then kind of like after Olympus, I was just playing around in that general DeFi space. I don't think I was a contributor in any capacity, but I was kind of involved a little bit with some of the RFV cartel. So just playing around with governance there, trying to figure out how to recoup some of the ohm fork capital that's been locked up in some of those protocols out there.
Yeah, Spice is really my first like foray into really diving into working or building on a specific protocol. Beforehand I was just like playing around myself as like an individual person, just managing whatever funds that I had. but this was like really my first full-time commitment to any type of DeFi protocol.
Awesome. And for NFTfi specifically, what made you guys kind of even start looking at the niche in general?
Yeah, I think like, well, we had been playing around with DeFi for quite some time, and we're really thinking about where's kind of like the next evolution of DeFi. Obviously, one of those kind of obvious spaces is really probably going to be just like more efficient structures on L2s, like high throughput exchanges and whatnot. But one area that we think wasn't explored, honestly, in any capacity was how non-fungibility would apply to finance. And part of kind of going into NFT finance was our conviction around, the value of non-fungibility, both that it can represent pretty large complexity in different assets, but I think more so in the sense that most of the assets, most of the items and things we interact with in, we'll call it the meatverse in real life, has a layer of non-fungibility to them. So that being your house, a car, intellectual property, even like if you're going into like video games, right, you'll have in-game items such as Counter-Strike skins. And so what we kind of thought was that NFTs are actually fairly suitable for representing a lot of assets on chain. And kind of the future for where DeFi is going to go is really toward toward NFT finance, non-fungible finance, Oracle-less designs, something that can represent more assets on chain than just fungibility. Obviously, there is like a set of problems that kind of goes along with that, and I think that's ultimately what attracted us, was the fact that when we looked at NFT finance, it actually wasn't that simple. It's not a very simple space, and I think we're at the very beginning. If anything, like we're pre-DeFi summer for where DeFi was. So I think that was what was really attractive for us, or at least for me, towards why we should go into NFT finance. I think Duncan might have some additional thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Ugo was saying. I think the only thing that I would add, or like I would maybe further emphasize upon, was for me, what was really exciting was like the potential, how wide like the NFT use cases can really be, right? Because I think that we're really just scratching the surface in terms of like the potential of the technology, that being like non-fungible tokens that exist on the blockchain in its current use case, that being PFPs and like arts and collectibles, right? I'm not necessarily bearish on PFPs and arts and collectibles. I think that they will persist as like the visual identification layer of, the blockchain based metaverse going into the future. But what really interests me is really the expansion of the use cases. We had mentioned GameFi assets, real world assets coming on chain as well, or even like financial positions in what's now termed as financial NFTs. I think that the like total addressable market, the total opportunities, the total use cases, the value propositions of NFTs as like, let's say, more so of a primitive than it is as an asset class, as most people like kind of currently view it, is something that really interests me. It just seems so vast of a space to play in. And then from there, I think that internally we've developed a thesis that, finance, the value proposition is just like unlocking capital efficiency within these assets, right? So I think that in any way that we can help bootstrap a digital economy by building out Spice as a protocol, helping other protocols that do or like provide a similar value proposition thrives, is something that is just exciting for me personally.
Yeah, I think a lot of the founders that we've interviewed in the NFTfi space kind of have a similar belief where PFPs and the like are not the fullest potential that NFTs have. And when it comes to Spice, I mean, the product is beautifully simple, I think, in like a overcomplicated ecosystem where things just try and get complicated for no reason. You guys do you guys do your thing very well. Could you give us a little rundown on how exactly that works on the back end? And just for people that are unaware, what exactly you do at Spice?
Yeah. So I guess, yeah, like with Spice Finance, we're really looking to, or we're looking to build an aggregator and a simplified liquidity protocol for just routing capital to the most promising NFT finance projects. I think what that means more simply is we build simple automated vaults for users to deposit their ETH or stablecoins and then earn yield across the NFT finance ecosystem. In order to get that off the ground, there's really like three core pieces of infrastructure that we had to build out. The first are like pricing feeds. So we aggregate a variety of pricing oracles, ML oracles, and whatnot to get appraisal values for the NFTs we like route to on these NFTfi exchanges. The second piece of infra are risk feeds. So not only do we measure the price of, or do we try to estimate the price of, let's say, an NFT or an NFT collection prior to building out a strategy, but we also have to understand what is the liquidity, what is the volatility. And so there's a set of oracles that effectively feed data around, how volatile an asset might be, and it feeds into other strategies that we have built out. And the final piece are just smart contracts. And these smart contracts aggregate existing protocols. So this is what kind of does the heavy lifting of when a user deposits ETH, that capital can get routed to an NFT finance protocol. It's not custodial in nature. And then they're able to earn that yield in Ether stablecoins, and that yield goes back to the original depositor. And that's all done using smart contracts. Those are kind of like the three pieces of infrastructure that allow for a really simplified user experience where all user really needs to do is hit deposit, and then they're able to earn yield in native token.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think what you guys do with that mechanism, was it like something that naturally came as like a second thought for, like, was it a natural thought that you guys had to start something like this, or was there a problem that you faced, that you experienced in NFTfi specifically, that made you want to start Spice?
I think it's a mix of both. Like, we knew we wanted to explore NFT finance, and immediately, like day one of going into NFT finance, we realized, holy shit, this is like pretty complicated and not very intuitive for an end user. And as we were kind of just trying to play around and get some experience in the space, we would just note down all the problems that we ran into. There were probably 20, 30 problems that are really plaguing the space. And we kind of decided to go after the one that felt the most promising at the time and the one that would kind of provide most value for users that are trying to get into the space. That being, having simplified automated deployment of capital in the NFT finance space.
And then for like how you kind of took that idea to market, what was that like thought process like? Because I know you guys started with like the Prologue Vault and then built out two others from there. What was the thinking behind each one and like the progression there?
Yeah, I can kind of speak on this. So yeah, I guess there were several things that were kind of involved. So we ended up starting with the Prologue Vault, and the Prologue Vault was, I think, primarily like a go-to-market execution or a go-to-market strategy that we wanted to execute upon. We were aware that none of our presences, or like we didn't have any kind of prior reputation or prior presence in the space. So we were aware that we needed to kind of make a splash with the launch of the protocol in and of itself in order to just get some eyeballs on Spice, for people to be aware of what like value proposition we were kind of bringing into the market. So that was really kind of the main driver, main motivation for the Prologue Vault as like the initial launch for Spice. Yeah, the initial product launch for Spice, right? So it was a way for us to be able to kind of bootstrap a community, reward early holders, and really just, kind of cause a scene in terms of like the uniqueness of the NFT as well as the vault and kind of the interplay between them. I guess kind of backing up, the Prologue Vault is the first vault that Spice has ever launched, and it's like the first external facing vault, right? So the money that's deposited into the Prologue Vault gets routed to the underlying marketplaces that we currently route to. So that being NFTfi, X2Y2, Arcade, BendDAO, DropsDAO, and a Pairspace. But in the same vein that it is a vault, it's also kind of a financial NFT in and of itself, or at least like the Prologue NFT. So unlike our other vaults, when you deposit into the Prolog vault, or at least when you initially deposited into the Prolog vault, you received an NFT receipt token. What we did that was pretty unique was we skinned the NFT receipt token with like a PFP collection that we had developed internally ourselves. So it was a cool way for like the community to be able to represent that they were part of Spice, and then, simultaneously it serves as like the receipt token for your position, right? So if you hold the NFT, the Prolog NFT, then you were able to easily just deposit and withdraw from the vault. And then likewise, the NFT also represents like the ETH position in that vault as well. So it was just like a pretty cool dynamic that we wanted to kind of experiment with, and then also like reward early holders with. It was also like a way for us to kind of bootstrap liquidity into the vault. So we ran a strategy immediately after the launch of the Prolog vault, which we called the Prolog playoffs, which was like essentially a bidding war via deposits into the vault in order to get more, PFPs that are, or like to increase your chance of getting assigned a PFP that's of a higher rarity in the collection. And we thought that went extremely well. Essentially, the question that is asked is like, using this bidding war method, being highly public with the vault, where you're able to bootstrap more TVL than you could if you just, drop the vault, I don't know, in the middle of the network without much of a splash. And I think that it was pretty successful. We were able to bootstrap it off the ground. But the story from there kind of goes, one, how do we increase the value of the Prolog vault and the Prolog NFTs for Prolog holders? And the kind of the answer that we provided to the community was this idea of like providing Prolog holders with an exclusive feature that we're calling Prolog leverage, which is an ability to kind of borrow against your Prolog and, by proxy, the ETH position in the Prolog, and loop that borrowed funds back into your position in order to, de facto increase your yields. So that's something that we launched, and that was kind of the purpose of the leverage vault. The leverage vault, being the vault that funds these loans that Prolog holders can give out, or that Prolog holders can take out. So that was a pretty successful launch. We learned a lot of things from there, right? Because, in some ways that was like kind of our foray into like settling loans onto our own platform. So there was a lot of learnings that we could take in terms of like further developing our strategies for the deployment of capital across the industry as a whole. And then lastly, or the latest vault that we released is what we call the flagship vault. The flagship vault is running a very similar strategy to the Prolog vault. The biggest difference is that the flagship vault is a public access vault, right? So we started to realize that the Prolog vault, it was very good in identifying a core community, and it was very good in like kind of receiving sticky TVL, just because, it was a very exclusive vault. It was kind of like, you could say potentially like detrimental to our attempt to increase the TVL of the protocol as a whole, just because like in the same way that the Prolog NFT is a receipt token, it's almost like a key into the vault as well. And the key was getting priced by the secondary market to be anywhere between 0.2 to 0.5 ETH. So there was like a 0.2 to 0.5 ETH barrier to even depositing into the Prolog vault and the earning yield. So that was really the main motivation for launching the flagship vault. It was just a way for us to just increase the base of users that we could potentially suck up TVL and, as such, reward them back yield. So that's kind of like the progression of how each of the vaults were launched and like the motivation behind each of the vaults. But that's how we got to where we are today.
Right. And as far as I understand it, the flagship vault especially has been performing really, really well since its launch. I think it was doing something like 40% APR last time I checked. How do you guys determine the split between different NFT collections and between marketplaces, or is it mostly just based off of opportunity, based off of what's out there on the market?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to note is Flagship and Prolog have the exact same strategy. So I know that Flagship, I think it's like printing like historical 40% APY. In that same time period, Prolog has also done that. It's just that Prolog also has has a lot more runtime in the past. So I think that's just like a first caveat. In terms of the strategy, or like where capital gets routed, collections and marketplaces, that's completely done algorithmically. We can get into the technicals of it, but effectively there are a few like financial engineering algorithms that determine that like try to maximize returns while also minimizing risk on the end user. So risk of kind of bad debt or negative exposure. And there's also like kind of other algorithms that kind of try to make sure that the collections are diversified, the marketplaces are diversified, and that the users aren't ever exposed to one marketplace for too long or too much exposure on a single marketplace, as well as just any given collection. But yeah, like I mentioned, the two pieces of infrastructure that can kind of like roll into that are the pricing infra and the risk infra. Combined, they effectively spit out what is like the optimal allocation of funds across the entire space. What's the best way to kind of get that yield? And that has resulted probably, I'm not entirely sure, but I imagine we're probably like a top 3 protocol in terms of native ETH yield on mainnet at the moment.
Yeah, and that's like, I don't know, that's like a pretty big fucking deal when you like, you kind of just glossed over it, but that's, I don't know, that's huge to me. And I see there's like a pretty big allocation towards Bendao specifically. Is that because of incentives mostly, or is that just a way for you guys to easily deploy without having to kind of wait for offers on some sort of peer-to-peer platform?
Yeah, that's likely temporary. X2Y2 recently migrated their system from like V2 to V3. So kind of X2Y2 bidding, which usually takes up, let's say 40 to 50% of the strategy, that's been somewhat offline for the last week and a half. So that's kind of the big reason you've seen a lot more exposure to Bendao. You're right in the sense that going to Bendao, or like let's say Drops, one of the P2Pool protocols, is a really easy way to get yield while you're kind of looking to deploy the more capital in the P2P space. And so that's kind of what's happening. Like as X2Y2 is getting migrated, Bendao is kind of the best place to put that yield in the meantime. So that's kind of like, I guess, how the algorithm probably tries to figure out why, or where to best send capital. And that just happens to be Bendao. In terms of incentives, those are accounted for and they're kind of market sold at the end of the week. We did build an infra for additional vaults where when users choose to spin up our vaults, or when we choose to spin up new vaults, we have the ability to not market sell kind of like the incentive tokens and let users just redeem the incentive tokens themselves. And I think that probably begins to look a little bit more exciting as you begin to think about Spice Finance as an aggregator, as kind of this layer on top of all these other marketplaces that could potentially begin to direct governance power and direct liquidity across the space as a whole, instead of just trying to earn yield.
Gotcha. And then on like the incentives bit specifically, I guess that's a pretty good segue into Blur and what you guys are thinking there. It looks like you have something that's been in the works for a little while. I'm wondering if there's anything you can share about the thought process there, what might be coming, if there's something specific to Blend specifically.
Yeah. So there's, I guess, like the main thing to talk about is just that, as you guys may know, Blur launched a lending product called Blend, and it has like pretty unique mechanisms, but we're very interested in the potential opportunity that it gives our depositors as a source of yield. And then also secondarily, it's also a unique, interesting value proposition in terms of like the points that the vault could accumulate and then as such distribute back to our depositors as well. So something that we've heard as of late, or at least ever since Blur launched its Blend product, is that a bunch of people, want exposure to these Blur points, but they've been complaining that it's like kind of hard to, or complicated to farm these points via lending themselves. So this is like, a very clear problem that Spice is like uniquely positioned to tackle. And this is something that, we want to step in and kind of capitalize on the opportunity that's presented here at Blend. As an aggregator, we're pretty agnostic to the protocols that we route to. We really just want to present our users with a good source of yield, no matter where that may lie. And we see Blend as a really interesting opportunity for us to aggregate into our system as well. The exact details are going to be released going into the future. The biggest thing that I can reveal is just that it's in the works, and we're currently in a sprint to get that product to market. So definitely follow along our Twitter, join our Discord in order to get like the latest updates in terms of where things stand, how you can get in early, and how can you take the biggest advantage of the vault when it drops in the near future.
Interesting. So you mentioned people wanting exposure to blur points and that kind of being, because that's like an additional thing that Spice would be providing in addition to being a lending aggregator. So it adds another element there, I think, that goes even beyond NFT lending to begin with, or NFT finance to begin with.
Yeah. So I think the way we really thought about, obviously Blend launching was pretty exciting for us, kind of validated a lot of our beliefs about where the space is going. I think the specific design, which I'm also happy to kind of dive into, makes it so that in an efficient market, there's going to be pretty attractive yield opportunities. But right now, the blur point farming, let's call it, just the points that users are getting massively subsidizes all the yield and for all the rates across blur lending. So in terms of APY, we haven't seen it be as attractive as, let's say, NFTfi or Arcade. And there's also a lot of reasons behind why that might be. But we have kind of identified that, one, there are a lot of users who want access to, something more automated on top of Blend. And the point distribution that Blend is giving users is incredibly attractive. I think the way we may think of it's worth thinking about it is the same way when we route capital across NFTfi, we get NFTfi points. They're going to be kicking off, and I'm sure Arcade might be doing something similar down the line. We want to be doing the same thing with Blur. It just so happens that because of Blur's valuation and the amount of points they're giving to the lending product and how difficult it is to go out and lend, that you're able to farm honestly a ridiculous amount of points in a pretty quick, short amount of time. But to do so autonomously is obviously is kind of where it really Spice shines. Those key pieces of infrastructure that we had built out were kind of built for something like this. And so those are really the motivations for kind of building on top. It's also pretty great exposure for us, I think, from a marketing side and PR side. I think it's going to get a lot of users looking into Spice, since obviously NFT finance itself is still a burgeoning field. And Blur, I think, has a little bit more mindshare than most NFT finance protocols out there.
Do you think it's feasible? I guess probably not, given you guys are giving out genuine loans, but do you think it's feasible that some of your lending activity on Blur could be marked as somewhat of a CYBIL, or do you think it's possible that some of it doesn't go through to get the incentives? Because I know that they're, compared to NFTfi at least, I don't think NFTfi is doing much to that end, but as far as I know, Blur is still trying to catch some of that activity, and getting mislabeled or being someone who gets caught there could be a bit of a bummer, to say the least.
Yeah, so that's always a risk, and I think that's something, as we get closer, we're going to advertise around the vault. I can give a quick plug to, there's this group called Underground Free Speech. We have pretty direct contact with the Blur team, and as we understand it, a lot of the decisions they have around, preventing Sybils and whatnot are really around preventing fake liquidity from coming in. So users that end up getting marked are ones that are kind of spoofing chain, that are canceling transactions before getting hit and whatnot. So they're users that are looking to get Blur points illegitimately. The entire strategy that we have developed is a fully legitimate strategy. It's probably, as they get closer to releasing APIs, probably something that is more likely than not going to be the market efficient strategy, the one that people converge to. And so we're not kind of concerned that like we're breaking any rules on Blur side, because as we know, like all the kind of accounts that have been marked and whatnot are players and accounts that have been trying to effectively find loopholes in the system. Everything we're doing is really around providing lending in a proper manner, and it just so happens that the proper manner pays a shit ton of points as well. So obviously, like we're doing a little bit more research into that, and that's something we're going to be advertising around the vault itself. But yeah, we're not too worried.
Awesome. Good to hear. And do you, I don't know if you have an answer to this, or if you do, if you're able to reveal, but do you have an idea of like what kind of yield you guys would be seeing from a strategy like this?
Yeah, so I'm hesitant to give numbers because the range is so wide and the numbers are so ridiculous. But yeah, like I think when we first started testing the strategy, and obviously like the meta is evolving in terms of lending basically day in, day out, but we were looking at like implied APYs in the thousands just from the Blur points that we were getting. Yeah, so they're pretty ridiculous.
And damn, okay, that's nuts. Cool. Okay, was not expecting that high of a number, to be honest. I want to.
Yeah, that probably paints the motivation around like why the points are attractive in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, attractive is an understatement. I think. I don't know that can be matched anywhere with something like this. I want to switch gears a little bit here away from Blur. We had, well, I guess more broadly about like competition. When I first started looking into Spice, what was really interesting to me about it was the fact that a competitor like doesn't really exist. Like anything that could be considered a competitor would really just add to Spice more than anything. And now almost a full year later, I guess, we're not really seeing many other people enter the space or the niche that you guys are specifically in. Why do you think that is? And also, like more specifically, we had Goblin Sachs on not long ago, and they were talking about productizing their offering. Do you have an idea of like what that looks like and how that would differ from what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure what Goblin Sachs is planning on doing. I know last time we had conversed, this was probably close to 6 months ago. They weren't really looking to do something that we were doing, but I kind of have to talk with the team to get a feel for where they're at. In terms of why we think that there aren't a lot of players doing what we're doing, the first is it's like really fucking hard. This is a big reason we even went after this problem, is that it's probably one of the more sophisticated and complicated problems to be dealing with, is like how do you deploy capital on these ultra complex marketplaces. And we've spoken to some players that are interested in kind of providing NFT yield solutions. Almost every single time they effectively just ask, how can we route capital to your vaults? How can we just deposit in your vault, because you guys have done the heavy lifting, like your vaults have already done all the hard work, and we're okay to pay the fees to get that exposure. So I think the difficulty piece is probably like one of the biggest moats there, and a big reason why you don't see a lot of players. And then the second piece, I think, is just NFT finance honestly doesn't have that much mind share at the moment. I'm very confident that we're going to see competitors down the line, but that's probably going to take place as the winning marketplaces begin to settle out, which I think we're pretty far away from that. Blend is probably one of the first marketplaces where we've looked at it and seen that, like with the distribution as well as the product they have, there's not that many improvements that can be made to improve on what they have for that specific target customer. But there's definitely pretty strong room for improvement across the entire NFT finance space. And I think it makes it pretty difficult to build an aggregator or build just like a simplified yield solution if you don't even know who's going to win, right? Like the same way someone might build, products on top of GMX and Arbitrum, you're going to have to know that GMX is going to be the winning protocol there. And that's just not that clear in the NFT finance space. And I think that probably prevents a lot of players from even beginning to tackle the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, lending protocols are a dime a dozen these days. I think a lot of people don't realize how many smaller ones exist there that, may not have too much of a marginal improvement over what already exists. And then for like because obviously we need time for the space to mature and for these tools to find greater like product market fit. Where do you see Spice fitting into that? Do you see, I guess it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem, but do you see Spice as bridging the gap for users who have never touched NFTfi before, or people who are maybe already familiar who are looking to, I guess, outsource their activity a little bit once they're already familiar with something like Blend or NFTfi?
Duncan, you want to take this?
Yeah, I think it's really a combination of both. We think that the deepest need is going to be from people who are outside of NFTfi, let's say more so leading into the DeFi scene who wants to gain exposure to the space. There's like a variety of reasons. One, potentially you believe in the same ethos as we do with NFT finance kind of expanding to many opportunities and a larger TAM going into the future. So you just want to be involved with that to whatever capacity, whether or not that's like exposure to airdrops, exposure to yields, whatever. And then secondarily, in the same vein, NFTfi as it currently exists right now is one of the highest sources of yield on ETH mainnet that you can get, right? So if you don't believe in the space and you are just a mercenary, there's still value to be gained from participating and providing liquidity into the space as well. Like we were saying, like a bunch of like exposure to the space is not simple, right? So we provide those users, that being like the DeFi users who are less familiar with a way to gain exposure without going through all of the work that they may need. We've heard from doing interviews with a bunch of lenders in this space that lending, at least on your own, is like more or less a full-time job, right? When it comes to like sifting through the loans, analyzing which ones are good, and then also like rebalancing your portfolio constantly, right? Because can be a somewhat volatile space to kind of operate in. So that kind of leads into like the second point of my answer, which is, secondarily, I think that there is still a value proposition that Spice can provide for current lenders in the space, that being just like a way for them to, potentially allocate some portion of their funds that they're already, lending out into the space into a more hands-free type of passive opportunity to earn yield while still remaining like keeping their exposure within the space, if that makes sense. So like if you're a lender and you still want to, play around with strategies that you developed, maybe you take some portion of your funds, do that, and then the remainder of the funds that you would already, allocate to loans, you can just deposit into Spice and not have to worry about constantly, managing that portion of your portfolio. So it's really like twofold. I think we target both types of users. I would say that what we're especially interested in is targeting the users from the outside, right? Because I think that, and I know that you're involved in this, Cedo and Ali, but like NFT finance can be somewhat of an echo chamber and a bubble. And I think that what is very important that we're hoping to do is, bring outside capital in, which is like a main motivation for this Blur Vault as well.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. And I mean, in terms of like for like existing lenders, even like the more savvy ones, like for what you can make with an active like lending strategy versus 40% from just throwing it in Spice and not having to think about it again is not a bad trade-off. Like even that is hard to outperform with like stringent risk parameters, especially given the time you have to put in, I think. So that's, something every lender will have to consider at some point, I think. I realize we touched base on Prologue way at the beginning on the NFT collection, but I didn't get to ask what's left to come for the NFT collection, if you guys have any other plans for Prologue holders in the future.
Yeah, I mean, there's always plans that we're working on. We always want to continue to add value to Prologue holders where we can, just because, these guys are like our core community members, right? Like I see Tum Tum here. I know that ND, Noral, MK, these guys all have Prologues. They're very active in our community and they've been supporting us for a while. So it's always like within our best interest to, support and provide value to those, core constituents where we can. But that being said, we want to make sure that like the products that we drop, for example, like the Prologue leverage feature, is something that like provides value and is what they need from the jump. And so we don't want to prematurely promise any kind of features, but what I can promise is that, we'll always be looking to add value to the users, whether or not that's for the current product or any future products that we kind of bring online into the future, maybe even outside of vaults.
Right, right. I mean, we talked a lot about incentives today. Have you guys thought about a broader incentive structure for Spice in the near future?
Yeah, we do I think a fair amount of thinking on this. It's largely informed on what that end product looks like, and that's something that obviously like we haven't revealed yet. But yeah, like proper incentive structures, as well as like taking advantage of the position we're in as an aggregator is both, like a premier liquidity router, a protocol that's able to control liquidity, able to collect governance tokens and whatnot. That's something that, like I said, we've thought about pretty heavily. There's a few ideas from some of our community members that we've been playing around with, but I think like our approach is really, make sure we build a good product first, make sure we really iterate and get something off the ground that works well for users, and then nail in a incentive structure that kind of gets that flywheel rolling. The last thing we want to do is build out an incentive structure that, kind of locks us into a specific type of product, and that product isn't really the best thing we could have built because we built the incentives around that product, and now you kind of have to deal with, there being economic incentives that are driving users in the wrong direction. So we try to approach incentives, I think, rather thoughtfully. We don't want to do so prematurely, which kind of could end in like the demise of a protocol. And that's probably one of the biggest lessons that we've taken away just playing around in DeFi. As much as like incentives and decentralization are at the very core of crypto, it's also something that can, if done incorrectly and prematurely, can absolutely cripple protocols. And so we just want to be very careful with how we do this, and we want to make sure that when we do it, it's done in such a manner that, it's like a full win-win situation for everyone involved.
Yeah, I think when you're really thinking about the potential token or some kind of decentralization in the form of governance, what a lot of people we talk to speak on is kind of thinking about the weakness within the protocol and kind of seeing how that token or that incentive structure can provide a solution or make that weakness less noticeable. When it comes to all the different strategies on Spice, the ones that you have now and the ones in the future, what would be that weakness that you guys think is kind of plaguing the protocol right now?
It's a good question. Duncan, you can definitely step in if you have anything. But I think one area that we are pretty cautious about in terms of building out incentive structures, I wouldn't say this is, I mean, I guess it could be considered a weakness, but it's also one of the areas that we try to put the most time into. And in many ways, it's our strength above what anyone else could build. NFTs tend to be very liquid, and they're like rather easy. I wouldn't say rather easy, like the smaller the market cap, the more liquid into the collections you go, the more manipulatable those collections are, the more volatile they are, in terms of price movement, in terms of what users are doing with that collection. And so it's something that we want to avoid is kind of a situation where end users can take advantage of whatever incentive structures we have in order to route liquidity to a collection that should have liquidity routed to them, for example. Or, I mean, like most of this gets determined algorithmically, but at the end of the day, the algorithms are also determined by liquidity itself. And so something we just want to be very careful of is preventing our systems from kind of exposing themselves to, let's say, like hostile market capture by malicious users that are trying to extract value. That's kind of a lot of the work that we've put into the like infrastructure that we've built out. A lot of behind the scenes work. We don't like talk about it too much because a lot of those algorithms are proprietary, the same way you might have it on, let's say, like Ribbon Finance. But it's definitely like one of the biggest failure points, I think, in NFT finance generally. You're playing around with like fairly liquid collections, In the same way, like Aave doesn't lend against super liquid shitcoins, like because oracles don't really do a good job of protecting against bad debt. If you're building with oracle-less designs, then you have to take that into account. You have to understand that there are those risks. And I think that's probably the biggest weakness of just like playing around in NFT finance. I think it's like the biggest area that users can get burnt. And it's the place that we kind of put the most work into as a team. And so I think incentives are really going to be built around that in mind, trying to prevent that from happening, but also having some kind of positive feedback loops that, various communities or individuals who want liquidity can get into.
Awesome. And when you're thinking about the iteration of the products that you guys offer, you guys have brought out like a bunch of different vaults. How much do the strategies differ, and what kind of iteration do you see coming in the future? Because the Goblin Sachs guys, when they were discussing their product faces more on like something like a non-custodial bot that kind of works for a user. Do you see a future where you guys lean into some non-custodial things? Do you see, different kinds of deployment, maybe both sides of the liquidity, maybe like pulling NFTs and Ethereum? Do you see yourselves deploying it in different places, maybe in strategies with like Wasabi with options? What kind of future iterations have you guys been the most interested in recently?
Yeah. So Wasabi is definitely on the table for us. We've been in contact with them, and I think we've announced a partnership with them. Yeah, so we're definitely not limited to lending in that sense. Like I think generally just NFT finance as a whole is on the table for us. I think we like to think about our products as broad as possible. One of the good positions of being an aggregator is we get a lot of information about all the products that are coming out there, and we're, as a protocol, I think we're probably some of the more entrenched users, so we have a pretty good idea of like where the intricacies lie. And so that also means like in terms of building our products, around where capital should get routed, what that strategy might be, maybe just offering vaults to, let's say, just a single bidding bot, or letting users spin up vaults with their own set strategies, with their own set parameters. Those are all things that are on the table that we've considered. So I think that's to say, like, there's definitely, for Spice at least, there's nothing that we consider to be off the table, just given kind of how much exposure we have to all the various different types of products out there, and where we have a pretty good idea of what needs improvement, what users want. So I think like some of the next iterations for Spice that kind of come, I would say, like toward the end of the summer, are probably going to be pretty surprising for a lot of users, because we've been really working on some kind of novel designs in the space, and we haven't limited ourselves to just NFT lending.
Awesome. That's great to hear that you guys are always focusing on iterating. We're leaning into the last few minutes. I don't want to keep you guys too long. We're going to lean into some like hot takes and more interesting questions about you guys personally. If you want to give us both of your kind of dream PFPs, other than the prologue PFPs, of course, are you ape guys or punk guys?
I'm definitely a punk guy. I kind of see them as the OGs, and that's definitely, I think I've always been aligned with that.
I'm a Lady Remilio World Order guy.
Awesome. And I know you spoke on this a bit about the kind of iterating for L2s in the NFTfi ecosystem. Are you guys ETH maxis? Are you guys multi-chain guys? What kind of camp do you guys reside in personally?
Yeah, I think I'm chain agnostic, but I also I have very high respect for what EVM and what ETH has done for crypto. And so I think even though I'm chain agnostic, most of the time I'm going to be interacting with ETH-based chains.
Yeah, I think I'm also like a multi-chain future type of person, but I think that honestly my future or my thesis is that like in the medium term we'll have a multi-chain future. I think long term everything consolidates into one chain. So there'll be like one settlement chain and then everything else will kind of be built on top of that. ETH is probably looking like the best bet for that future as of now, but that isn't to exclude any value that's created until that potentially happens.
This is completely random, but I just thought of this. Are you guys even taking a glance at the whole ordinal stuff, do you think there's a chance they build like a lending borrowing market in that ecosystem? Do you find it interesting at all?
Yeah, we got put on to some project that's trying to build lending on ordinals. I don't know how feasible it is. Like, I minted an ordinal, but besides that, I haven't really been kind of too tapped into the ecosystem. Because I'm like, even though I'm chain agnostic, it seems like my Twitter feed's a little bit ETH echo chamber centric.
Yeah, there was a guy in our community that was putting us on some ordinal stuff and some ordinal lending stuff, but it seems like, as far as I know, they're all rugs. So there hasn't been anything that's been robust that's been built out yet. And where we follow is where the volume kind of pops up. So although we'll have some interest in that space, for now it's just like keeping an eye on it is where we stand.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you guys taking the time. Thank you guys so much for coming on. Last few minutes, do you guys want to do anything we missed? Anything you guys want to mention?
No, I think that's pretty much covered it. Ollie, it was nice to catch up with you again. It's always a pleasure talking to you guys about this stuff. Love the Exit Liquidity podcast and what you guys are up to. All I'll say is that things are going to get shaken up at Spice within the next month and a half. So definitely follow along. We're hoping to restart things and shake things up. So new vaults, new community, new people coming in. That's the goal. So definitely follow our Twitter if you're interested, and then also come onto our Discord so that you don't miss any of the alpha that we're going to drop there.
Great stuff. Yeah, excited for that. Definitely be watching along. Cool. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate this.
No, thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for everybody that was listening. We're gonna be dropping some like clips and stuff, and the full episode will be on our Twitter. Appreciate you guys coming on.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
See ya.
Deuces.
Bye.
See you guys.